Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates.
The Indian GDP has contracted at a historically low level, 23%, 23.9% to be exact. This suggests that the lockdown has had an even worse impact on the economy than many people had feared. Where should the economy go from here? India is unlocking, but is it unlocking swiftly enough? The serological surveys at the same time seem to suggest that the number of those actually infected who've actually recovered is much higher than we ever thought. And the corollary is that the IFR, or the infection fatality rate, is in fact much lower than we feared. But at the same time, every day new details emerge of even complications that take place in some individuals after recovery, children among them. Here at Mojo Story, we've been tracking all of those stories. On the program today, we're joined by a very special newsmaker, someone who bravely shared her own personal battle with COVID, but is also a leading light of the business world, here to talk about the twin battles against the pandemic and the battle now to save the economy is Biocon's Kiran Shaw. Kiran, I must start by saying that you look well and good, and I hope you are. How many days have you been battling COVID? And share with our viewers a little bit of what that battle was like and what you did to fight it.
So, Barkha, thankfully, I've put COVID behind me because it's been 15 days since I battled with this disease, but it was a very mild experience, I must add. And I'm now COVID-free because I just tested negative yesterday.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah. So I would say that, my experience has been that, it's important to test the moment you feel any mild symptoms. I don't think anyone should wait for the symptoms to worsen, because I think by treating early, it is a very, very mild disease. And I think this is where I really want to make some comments.
Yeah.
The COVID crisis can easily be managed if only we really use science and we use some common sense in our scientific rationale. For instance, I think most of the mortality is being caused because people are in denial, people are not testing early, and they're testing when it's a bit too late. And therefore, when I've spoken to a lot of the doctors in hospitals who are treating patients, they all tell me that yes, these patients are presenting at a much later stage in the disease when, the cytokine storm has broken out.
Yeah.
And especially a lot of people with comorbidities are presenting themselves very late. And that is what is actually causing these complications, severity, and mortality. So I personally believe if we really focus on testing early and treating early, we will eliminate the mortality altogether.
How soon did you test? Did you test right away after you got fever? Did you wait a couple of days?
Absolutely. The day I felt feverish, I felt feverish one night. And the next morning I didn't feel too much better. So I immediately decided to test. Okay. If I had waited, like a lot of my friends have done and whom I've been talking to, who basically were in denial saying, no, we don't have COVID. No, let's wait for a couple of days.
Yeah.
I've seen many of them worsen and end up in hospital. In my case, I was home quarantined because I had tested early. My viral load was not very high and my symptoms were very moderate. So I felt, okay, I could manage it at home because my oxygen, my breathing, everything was normal.
Yeah.
And then, of course, being a scientist, I tracked my inflammatory markers and what have you. Yeah. And it was not at all difficult. And, the doctors who I was consulting with were excellent. So they
what did they treat you with? What did they treat you with?
Well, all I did was, because I was at home, I took an antiviral, which was favipiravir. Of course, I was before COVID, at the early stages of COVID, and anyway, before that, I was always on a course of vitamin C and vitamin D and baby aspirin and what have you. So I was taking all these medications. And as I said, I was I'm a big believer in Chavan Prash.
Okay.
So you know,
So that helped you.
I mean, it's not that. It's just that I am a very active person. I keep
Yeah.
myself fit. I do yoga. I do gymming. So I think all that has helped in helping me kind of fight off this virus. But having said that, I still feel that anybody who tests early and is treated early has a very mild experience.
And in your case, you were worried about your mother, who I think is 89, a cancer survivor, your husband, who's a cancer patient, also in his 70s. Obviously, that was a big concern. So
Yeah.
what did you do? You isolated completely from them?
Yeah, I was completely self-isolated. Fortunately, I have a large enough home where I don't come anywhere close to my mother or my husband.
Yeah.
So I just isolated myself for 2 weeks, and I think and then during that time, of course, I did have my husband and my mother and my staff tested.
Yeah.
They were all negative twice over. So then I knew that I had completely, quarantined myself away from all of them.
Well done. It's actually good to have you back, hale and hearty, and also setting an example that one doesn't need to be paranoid. Test early,
Yeah.
look after yourself. Now, talking about the panic, I think what's going to create the panic, Kiran, is the GDP numbers. And even before the pandemic, we were seeing a kind of deacceleration of the economy. The GDP numbers were reflecting that. These numbers are, of course, for April to June, the first quarter when the lockdown was complete. But perhaps much worse than we feared. And it will lead people, your friend Rajiv Bajaj, for example, to turn around and say, see, I told you so, this lockdown is going to flatten the GDP, not the curve. That's what he'd said in an interview to me. Looking at these numbers and wearing your business hat, how do you read them?
Well, it is certainly very alarming because, we've shrunk 23.9% of our GDP, and that's almost a quarter of our, growth. Our GDP has been eroded, and that's not a good state to be in. And like you said, even before COVID, we had started decelerating, which was not a good thing. And this, of course, has completely, decimated any, semblance of growth.
Yeah.
Now, I think what is really worrying for me is the fact that a lot of people are predicting a revival, a V-type curve or W-type curve, whatever, or a U-type curve. But for me, again, just like it was before COVID, where is the demand? Where is the demand going to come from?
Yeah.
Now, the only silver lining in these numbers is the fact that agriculture has grown 3%. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one thing about agriculture is that you can actually stimulate some of the ancillary sectors, such as the fertilizer industry, such as the agricultural equipment industry, such as maybe the logistics industry. Maybe, hopefully, this is a time when they should actually look at beefing up the agricultural storage and logistics infrastructure. That is something which they ought to look at, because that can generate jobs, that can generate, activity and some amount of further agricultural growth. But really, when you talk about manufacturing and services, which has taken the biggest hit, Barkha, the question I want to ask is, when everyone talks about services, you only think about IT services. And that is really very minuscule when it comes to the rest of the services that have been impacted. Remember, the IT services sector accounts for about just a little less than $200 billion. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's only about 10 or 12% of our overall, about 10% of our GDP, if you were to call it that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about the services industry, as in the hospitality and tourism industry, which has got the worst hit, how are you going to generate demand?
Yeah.
The construction industry, the real estate industry has also had a big hit. Okay.
Yeah.
How are you going to generate and stimulate demand is the question.
Yeah.
I know that, Maharashtra just announced that they were going to reduce the registration fees of property purchases to 2%. At least that is something.
Yeah.
But you need to focus on generating and stimulating demand. Do you think that we can just, hope that everything is going to revive in the hospitality sector? I think it's going to take a couple of years before you get back to pre-COVID growth, right?
Yeah.
Hotels, tourism, holidays. Do you think it's going to happen at the same rate?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But have you
Air
heard
travel.
have you heard anything so far that looks like the kind of stimulus we need? The finance minister's statement saying act of God has not, I think, gone down too well either. People were wanting more specific responses, Kiran. The chief economic advisor insists that there's a V-shaped recovery, but at least at the moment, as you said, other than the agricultural sector, we've not seen that recovery in any sector. So what do you think the government should be doing or saying at this point?
You know, Barkha, one of the biggest deterrents of growth in our country have been the very, very overarching regulations that have not allowed ease of business.
Yeah.
Let's not kid ourselves. Going up some rankings is ridiculous because we know how bad things are. I mean, I know how many formalities and regulations I have to go through as a pharma sector, okay, which of course is a highly overregulated sector. But I know that every sector, the banking sector or any manufacturing sector, is overregulated. It is not easy. It is expensive to go about doing business in India. Why can't we at least use this as a stimulus, saying that we're going to get rid of half the regulations and link it to some kind of an demand stirring activity? Because if you at least reduce the cost of regulations, you might be able to lower the cost of the products or whatever it is. Yeah. So I think there needs to be some creative thinking in the way you're going to stimulate demand. Regulatory reforms is a very major way of stimulating investment, at least.
Do you think this is getting the kind of attention it deserves? I was interviewing Mahesh Vyas of CMIE, and his data shows that close to 19 million salaried Indians lost their jobs since April, that the only recovery did take place in the agricultural sector. So you saw a blip of those numbers getting better. And he's warning of an economic disaster if the economy is not the only priority of the government right now. Do you believe that it's getting the attention it should? It certainly isn't in
It is not getting
channels.
the attention it should. It is not getting the attention it should, Barkha, because I really believe that if it did get the attention, you would actually hear a large number of policy changes, regulatory reforms being announced, and a lot of stimulus packages being announced. I haven't heard anything that gives me the hope and confidence that you're going to have a V-shaped recovery. I really believe we are still dragging our feet. We are still in denial. We still have all this, various policy makers saying, oh, it's going to revive, don't worry. Mm-hmm. What do you mean, don't worry? Where are your real indicators and signals of recovery? Yeah. That to me is a bigger worry. And I think we can actually come out of this if we only were not in this state of denial. I think we should accept the fact that there is a challenge, there is a problem, but we can get out of this mess. And I really believe we should take this opportunity. For instance, we know that today the digital, economy has taken off. Okay, and we ought to actually make it very, very simple for people to overcome many of these regulatory barriers by doing a lot of things online, by making things transparent, by making things fast, by making things self-regulatory, because it's online. See, whenever anything is online, you can track it very easily. And that's the kind of software you need to basically boost growth, boost confidence, and give some semblance of predictability. So I think why are you not seeing investment coming into India despite the alienation of China? Why is it that it's just kind of, overlooking India and going off somewhere else? Yeah. Right? The reason is, I've heard it time and time again from many of these quarters, that they are not comfortable with the reliability and predictability of Indian policies. Yeah. They believe that, there are a lot of inducements to come into India, but the moment they come into India, there are policy changes that really deters their investment decisions. So I think this is something which we have to address.
So at the
I think
core
there
of
is a
your
need for
suggestion,
us.
at the core of your suggestion is basically regulatory reform. That it's just too tough and too complicated, too bureaucratic to do business, even at this point, even in the middle of a pandemic. What else? What else would you suggest? Would you suggest greater government spending? Nitin Gadkari is talking about infrastructure, but how much can the government spend at this point?
Look, I think there is a huge trust deficit that the government has with the private sector. And even civil society has a lot of trust deficit with the private sector. Now, you've heard that every time private sector is roped in to do something in infrastructure, there's a huge backlash, which is very unfair. I mean, here are private sector companies willing to actually enter into public spaces and build infrastructure, right? And yet, civil society is actually objecting to that, which is ridiculous. I mean, let's start looking at this whole healthcare area. I think healthcare itself and investing in healthcare can actually make a big difference to GDP growth itself, because we are very underinvested in healthcare. And we know that the healthcare sector is a big job creator, is a sector that can actually add to the GDP. Okay? The pharmaceutical sector is another sector that will definitely expand its manufacturing capacity with the right incentives, so on and so forth. So I think one needs to look at some of these areas very, very carefully, because I really believe that that's what the government ought to do.
Has the government been reaching out to the private sector at all? And I ask you this because the finance minister's statement referencing COVID as an act of God, it became the subject of memes, it became the subject of an opposition attack. When you heard her saying that, when she was explaining the GST shortfall, what did you think?
The question I really want to ask is, fine, it might be an act of God, nobody is denying that. But where are your solutions? I don't want to hear you making comments on acts of God. I want to hear what is it that you have in mind to get us out of this crisis. That is what everyone wants to know. So what are your policies? What are your, your measures that you're going to take? What are your stimulus packages? What is it that you're going to do to spur the economy? That is what we've been asking even pre-COVID.
Yeah.
That's the same question we're asking now, even in at a bigger scale.
Is the government reaching out? Is the government reaching out?
I don't think so. I don't think the government is really reaching out to any part of industry to even listen to what they're saying. So even if we give them suggestions, I don't think they want to implement it.
Why do you think that is?
I think there is a huge financial challenge, which fair enough. I mean, there is a financial challenge. You can see that GST itself is a big challenge for the government to share with the states. So that tells you that there is a big financial challenge. And yes, the government has had a big challenge because they have had to part with a lot of, their finances in terms of looking after this crisis in many, many ways. And you can see that there has been a problem in terms of, dealing with this crisis. It is a very expensive crisis to deal with because, the kind of healthcare that they've had to deliver to the common man is very expensive. Yeah. And then they have to now look at what do they need to do with in terms of procuring the vaccine, doing a lot of development, improving the healthcare ecosystem in the country, etc., etc. So it's not easy for the government. Plus, there's been this huge exodus of people into the rural reaches of our country, and they've had to deal with that calamity as well. So I think they are financially challenged, and I think they really don't have the financial muscle to roll out a lot of the stimulus packages which they would like to, I'm sure. But I think having said that, not everything is about money. I go back to this point. Things are about making things easier for people to run their businesses. And let me tell you, it's not about just big businesses. It's about the SMEs. It's about the small shop owner. It's about the guy who fixes your motorcycle or your car. These are the people who are out of jobs today. The construction worker, the supervisor at construction sites. These are the people who have lost their jobs and their livelihoods. How are we going to make sure that we give them an opportunity? So I think the government has to think out of the box. The government has to think about bringing back the economy for this, for small jobs. It's not just about helping the big companies, because the big companies are not big employers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to look at it in a much more open and holistic way, is what I feel.
Now, to come back to the coronavirus pandemic itself, I think early on, there were those of you who said that there was too much of a paranoia around testing positive. And that is also what's impacted consumer sentiment. We need people to go out, need people to go back to some of their normal activities. But the problem is the way the data and the numbers are being communicated. So every day, Indians are reading that we are hitting record highs, record surges, but nobody is coming out and talking about the serological surveys. And because you're a woman of science, I want you to talk about this. The serological surveys in Mumbai, Delhi, and Pune clearly tell you that the actual number of Indians infected by the virus are much higher than the official numbers. Most of them were asymptomatic. They recovered without even knowing they had the disease, and now they have the antibodies. The corollary should be that the infection fatality rate, the number of people dying from this infection, is not as high as we feared. Why is nobody coming out and saying this clearly? Because maybe it would give people the confidence to start resuming some economic activity, some parts of their normal lives.
Thank you, Barkha, for saying that. First and foremost, I believe that COVID is not being managed well at all. For instance, there should be a lot more awareness creation by the governments across the country to say, please don't panic. Please don't be fearful of COVID. If you feel symptoms, please get yourself tested.
Yeah.
Okay? And there ought to be various testing models that combine antibody tests, antigen tests, and PCR tests. And if you were to do it in a proper model, you would actually get an idea of, what is the infection rates in your communities, how many have recovered, how many are mildly infected, and how many are require ICUs. Okay, that is the kind of data you need to get.
Yeah.
I, for one, believe that if you can actually work towards preventing anyone going into an ICU, everybody will feel comfortable and relieved that this is not such a bad pandemic.
Yeah.
But we have not allowed it to happen that way, because everyone is today suffering from a stigma saying, oh, I don't want to announce that I have tested positive. And that is why I announced that I tested positive. Because why should you panic? Why should you think it is embarrassing to say that you tested positive? I know a lot of people who don't want to say they've tested positive. Because we also have taken some silly measures like saying, now, the municipality is going to cordon off your area. And if you live in an apartment, your entire apartment is going to be cordoned off. And people feel embarrassed for putting their neighbors to that kind of inconvenience. But we don't need to take such desperate measures. I really think we need to understand the disease better. And I have said,
when you made the statement that it is not being managed well at all, where are the major failings?
Yeah, so the reason it's not being managed well, like you said, for instance, we are constantly focusing on the numerator. How many cases were added today? How many cases were added yesterday? How many cases are being added every day? Yes, I think the daily addition of cases is a worry. But don't forget, out of the 3.5 million cases that have been reported, over 2 million cases have recovered. And as you said, in many parts of the country where the cases are not even reported, you've seen that there is already some herd immunity developed in many of the congested areas.
Yeah.
So who is getting those numbers? Who is doing a study and saying, hey, by the way, a large number of people have recovered, and we should actually make sure that people are testing early, being treated early, and that the number of people getting into ICUs is reducing day by day. Now, if you find that the number of people getting into ICUs is reducing day by day, won't you feel more comfortable?
I mean,
And if you
the
actually
government
report
does say this, the government does talk about recovery rate, but it doesn't talk about the serological surveys because it would probably mean admitting that this official tally
Yeah.
is wrong, that the
Yeah.
actual number of those infected is much higher. And it's counterintuitive to say this, but that's good news.
But it doesn't matter. Look, I think there are lots of views on this. But to
Yeah.
me, the real messaging is that, look, there are a large number of people infected, but most of them are recovering with mild disease. Yes, we are keeping an eye on the people who are severe or having very severe symptoms. But we think that if they actually report themselves earlier, even those patients won't be severe. That is the messaging that has to go. And I can tell you, the moment we can manage COVID better, everything will open up.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be worried. Today, people are so scared and terrified of testing positive.
Yeah.
And I have been telling everybody, listen, since you have tested right now at a very early stage, I guarantee you will have a mild experience because we know how to treat you. And all of them are coming out mild.
So is the problem the messaging or the management?
Both.
So
let me tell you, most of our doctors are treating symptoms and not the cause. So if people are having breathing problems, they are giving more oxygen. That's not the way to treat a patient. The patient is having breathing problems because there are inflammatory markers that should be detected, and you should be controlling the inflammation, not just the oxygen levels. So I'm just trying to tell you, there is a problem in managing COVID patients. And I think there is also a problem in messaging.
Yeah. I finally want to ask you because, and I asked you about COVID because clearly the economic activity, while down even before the pandemic, has really taken a bad hit. If Nirmala Sitharaman were to pick up the phone tomorrow and call you and say, Kiran, what's the one piece of advice you'd give me? What would that be?
There's not one piece of advice, Barkha. There are many pieces of advice we can give. Look, please focus on creating demand. Yeah. And any measures, incentives, stimulus that you can provide to create that demand, please go all out. And it's not always about money. Everybody is worried about, how will I do it? My exchequer can't allow it. But it's, as I mentioned to you, the stimulus is not about just money. The stimulus can be about, regulatory relief, right? And I even told you that today it's a case of saying that, okay, the Maharashtra government has reduced the registration fees to 2%. Now, either you can say, they're going to lose X amount of money because they've reduced it, or the other way of looking at it is, we wouldn't have got any money, at least now we'll get some money because there will be some inducement for people to buy property at such low registration levels. And because you're going to announce it for a short period of time, there will be people who will want to go and buy it during this window.
I think the most important thing that I'm picking up from you is, one, end the paranoia around testing positive. B, the government has to make the economy its top priority. And C, it needs to look at the regulatory space. It needs to reach out to business leaders. Thank you, Kiran. And thank you also for being so transparent about your own COVID illness. 2 weeks and you're back. You've tested negative. So well done. And thank you so much for talking.
Thanks, Barkha. Thank you very much. Let's hope that the days ahead are going to be better and brighter.
Absolutely.